Ben Carter, a widowed former Army mechanic, lives a quiet, struggling life in Thomas, Georgia, raising his son Logan. Fixing a stranger's truck on a dusty road, Ben's selflessness catches the eye of the mysterious driver, General Nathaniel Caldwell. The next morning, three black SUVs arrive at Ben's rundown home, revealing Caldwell's high-ranking status. He offers Ben a life-changing opportunity, recognizing his character over credentials. As Ben hesitates, the envelope on his table holds a future for him and Logan. What secrets did that truck carry, and why does a powerful man seek a humble mechanic? Loved Ben's inspiring story? Help us share more tales of everyday heroes. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. Share your own act of kindness below. It could spark change. Join our community and let's honor those who quietly make a difference. Thank you. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of a rural Georgia road, where Ben Carter knelt beside an old farmer's battered pickup truck, his hands slick with grease and his faded t-shirt clinging to his sweat-soaked back. Tools lay scattered around him like loyal companions, each one an extension of his steady hands. He tightened a bolt with deliberate precision, his focus unshaken despite the sharp jab of his neighbor's voice cutting through the humid air. "Fixing another man's truck for free, huh? Your own roof's still dripping like a sieve, ain't it?" The sarcasm dripped heavier than the summer heat, but Ben didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. His silence wasn't defiance. It was just Ben, steady as ever, pouring himself into the work. A few feet away, in the passenger seat of their beat-up sedan, his 5-year-old son, Logan, sat quietly, sipping apple juice from a plastic cup, his wide eyes fixed on his father. To Logan, Ben was a giant, a man who could fix anything. Cars, tractors, maybe even the world. The boy's trust was a quiet weight Ben carried, heavier than any toolbox. The next morning, the sleepy rhythm of their small town shattered. 3 sleek black SUVs, their tinted windows gleaming like obsidian, rolled to a stop in front of Ben's weathered house on the edge of Thomas, Georgia. The neighbor, still nursing his coffee behind a frayed curtain, froze, his mug halfway to his lips. "Who was that old man?" he muttered to himself, his earlier smugness replaced by unease. The convoy wasn't just out of place, it was surreal, like a scene from a movie that didn't belong in their world of sagging porches and dusty fields. Why would a high-level government entourage show up at the doorstep of a broke mechanic with nothing but a rusted toolbox and a stubborn conscience? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the vehicles idled with a low, ominous hum. Inside Ben's home, the morning unfolded with its usual quiet rituals. The faint whir of an old ceiling fan battled the stillness, its blades wobbling as they stirred the warm air. The floorboards creaked under Ben's boots, each step a reminder of the house's slow decay. In the kitchen, the soft clink of spoons against chipped ceramic bowls mingled with Logan's sleepy chatter. This was their life now, a far cry from the controlled chaos of the military motor pool where Ben had once been Sergeant Carter, lead heavy-duty mechanic for the U.S. Army's 1st Armored Division. Back then, he'd commanded respect, his hands coaxing life back into tanks and Humvees under the relentless pressure of deadlines and deployments. Now, at 30, he lived on the fringes of Thomas, in a house that sagged under the weight of time. The roof leaked during heavy rains, sending water dripping into mismatched pots. The porch steps groaned under even Logan's slight weight, and the heater coughed more than it warmed. But it was home, a fragile sanctuary for Ben and his son. Life had carved deep lines into Ben, though his years didn't show it. His hands, calloused from years of wrenching and welding, told a story of service, but the deeper scars were invisible. 3 years ago, his wife, Melissa, had been stolen by cancer after an 11-month battle that left them both hollowed out. She'd been the kind of woman who could light up a room with a single smile, smart, steady, and kind in a way that felt like a gift. A high school math teacher, Melissa had been the architect of their dreams, mapping out their future with precision. The perfect time to start a family, the right school district for Logan, the savings plan that would carry them through. But cancer didn't care about plans. It came like a thief, and when it left, it took her with it. Ben's world had cracked open, and he'd walked away from the Army soon after. The military had supported him through her illness, Medical leave, hospital visits, all of it. But after she was gone, he couldn't stay. Logan, barely 2 at the time, needed a father more than the Army needed another mechanic. So Ben traded his uniform for flannel shirts and a life pieced together from odd jobs. Now he fixed tractors in barns older than his grandfather, hauled fertilizer one day and drywall the next, or pulled night shifts as a delivery driver. On weekends, he sometimes worked backup at Henderson's Auto, a garage run by an old Army buddy who understood the weight of Ben's silences. The money was never steady, but it kept the lights on, put food on the table, and covered Logan's daycare bill. Ben didn't complain. He didn't have the energy for it. His days began with the same quiet devotion, pouring cereal or scrambling eggs for Logan, packing a tiny backpack with snacks in a toy truck, kissing his son's forehead, and dropping him off at Miss Janine's daycare. Every evening, no matter how bone-tired he was, how much grease stained his hands, or how his back ached from hours bent over engines, he bathed Logan, read him a bedtime story, usually about trucks or superheroes, and tucked him in. Good dads show up, he'd whisper to himself, a mantra to keep the exhaustion at bay. Even when the tank was empty, he showed up. But the nights were crueler. In the quiet, when Logan's soft snores filled the house, the memories crept in like uninvited guests. Ben would sit on the back porch, a mug of cold coffee in hand, staring into the dark. He'd think of Melissa, her laugh, the way she'd tease him about his terrible handwriting, the nights they'd sat in that same spot, dreaming of a bigger house, maybe another kid someday. He'd remember his deployments, the stories that still clung to him like engine grease, the roar of tanks, the camaraderie of his unit, the weight of responsibility. And he'd remember the first time Logan called him Daddy after the funeral, his tiny voice piercing through the fog of grief. Those were the nights Ben cried, alone staring at a pile of bills he wasn't sure he could pay, wondering how he'd keep it all together for the boy who believed he was invincible. The weight of the world pressed heavy on Ben Carter's shoulders, a familiar ache that came not from physical strain, but from the quiet battles he fought every day. Money was always tight, the kind of tight that made you check the gas gauge twice before starting the truck, or skip a meal so your kid could have seconds. Yet beneath the worry, Ben carried something unshakable, a silent strength, not the kind that drew applause or medals, but the kind carved out in the small, unnoticed moments. It was there when he stayed up past midnight, hunched over a neighbor's broken tractor, knowing they couldn't pay him. It was there when he pulled over in the rain to change a stranger's tire, his own tank hovering on empty. Ben didn't do these things for praise. He did them because of a code, one etched into his soul years ago by a gruff first sergeant in boot camp. You help because it's right, not because it's rewarded. That lesson had rooted deep, guiding him through the chaos of war zones, the sterile grief of hospital rooms, the heavy air of funeral parlors, and the worn sidewalks of their small Georgia town. For Ben's son, Logan, his father was more than just the man who paid the bills or fixed the sink. He was a hero, not in a cape or uniform, but in faded, oil-stained jeans and work boots scuffed from years of labor. Logan, with his wide, curious eyes, would sit cross-legged on the garage floor, watching Ben tinker with a carburetor or patch a tire. The boy's small fingers would sometimes reach out, tracing the jagged scars that crisscrossed his father's hands. "Did you get this one fixing a tank, Daddy?" he'd ask, his voice brimming with awe. Ben would pause, a soft smile tugging at his lips, and nod. He never told Logan the truth, that some scars came from places darker than any engine, from nights that left wounds no tool could fix. Those stories stayed locked away, buried beneath the steady rhythm of their quiet life. They didn't have no shiny new car, no beach vacations, no savings account to cushion the hard months. But what they had was enough, a life built on resilience, on bedtime stories read by flashlight, on laughter shared over mismatched plates at the kitchen table. To outsiders, the Carters' existence might seem plain, even forgettable. But within the walls of their modest home, something enduring was taking shape. It was a legacy, not of wealth or fame, but of a father teaching his son how to live with integrity, how to stand tall when the world tried to bend you low. The Georgia sun hung low in the sky, painting the back highway in hues of gold and amber as Ben steered his battered Ford along the familiar route. The truck rattled with every bump, a reminder of the repairs he couldn't afford. In the back seat, Logan sat buckled in, his small frame swaying slightly as he hummed a tuneless melody, clutching a juice bottle. His sneakers tapped rhythmically against the seat, a habit that always made Ben smile. They'd just finished a delivery for Henderson's Hardware, 20 bags of soil hauled to a nursery on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but the cash would cover groceries for the week, maybe even a little extra for Logan's school supplies. Ben's hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the wheel tightly, his mind already drifting to the next job, the next bill, the next way to keep their fragile world spinning. As they rounded a bend, the endless stretch of farmland came into view, dotted with weathered barns and rows of corn swaying in the breeze. That's when Ben saw it. A truck, older than his own, parked crookedly on the shoulder. Its hood was propped open, steam curling upward like a distress signal. Beside it stood a man, tall and gray-haired, his mud-stained jacket hanging loose on his frame. He stared into the engine, unmoving, his face etched with a calm that felt almost otherworldly. Ben's foot eased off the gas, his instincts kicking in. One hand stayed on the wheel while the other reached behind the seat, fingers brushing the worn canvas of his tool bag. "Hang tight, buddy," he said to Logan, his voice steady but warm. Logan's humming stopped. He leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "You gonna help him, Daddy?" he asked, his voice bright with the unshakable faith that his father could fix anything. Cars, people, the world. "Looks like he needs it," Ben replied, pulling the truck onto the shoulder. Dust swirled around the tires as they came to a stop. He stepped out, the late afternoon heat wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The older man didn't wave or call out. He just gave a single nod, his eyes tracking Ben's approach with a quiet intensity. Most stranded drivers Ben had helped were frazzled, their voices tight with frustration or panic. But this man was different. He stood as if he'd been expecting this moment, not waiting for a tow truck or a jump start, but for something deeper. Something Ben couldn't name. Ben leaned over the engine, the sharp smell of oil and rust filling his lungs. "Corroded terminals," he muttered, his trained eye scanning the tangle of wires and bolts. "Timing's probably off, too. This thing's got to be older than I am." He glanced at the man, expecting a grunt or a comment, but got nothing, just that steady, unreadable gaze. "Name's Ben," he said, pulling a wrench from his bag and offering a small smile. Still the man said nothing, his silence heavy but not unkind. Ben didn't mind. He'd worked alongside enough old veterans and tight-lipped farmers to know that some folks spoke more with their eyes than their mouths. He set to work, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years coaxing life back into broken things. The quiet was shattered by a voice, sharp and sneering, slicing through the stillness like a blade. "Well, look at St. Carter, fixing some stranger's truck while his own house falls apart." Ben's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. He knew that voice, Mr. Dobbs, his neighbor from down the street, a man who seemed to take pleasure in pointing out every crack in Ben's life. Dobbs was walking along the road, his boots kicking up dust, his face twisted into a mocking grin. "Should have spent that time patching your roof, Carter. Gonna rain this weekend, you know." Ben's hands paused for a fraction of a second, the wrench hovering over a bolt. A flicker of anger stirred in his chest, mingling with the familiar sting of shame. Dobbs wasn't wrong. Ben's roof was leaking, his porch sagged, and his truck needed new tires. But he pushed the feelings down, the way he always did, and kept working. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the road. He'd learned long ago that men like Dobbs thrived on reaction, and Ben refused to give him the satisfaction. In the back of the truck, Logan's small face pressed against the window, his eyes darting between his father and the stranger. He didn't know what Mr. Dobbs meant about the roof, but he felt the meanness in the man's tone, and it made his stomach knot. He wanted to yell something to defend his dad, but he stayed quiet, his hands clutching the juice bottle like an anchor. Logan didn't understand why some people were so cruel, but he knew one thing. His dad was the kind of man who helped, no matter what. And that was enough for him. Ben Carter had long since abandoned the shallow pursuits that consumed folks like Dobbs. the kind who measured their worth in social clout and polished appearances. Those things had lost their luster the day Melissa took her last breath, leaving Ben with a hollowed-out heart and a little boy to raise. The world of status felt like a distant, irrelevant shore he'd never return to. From the back seat of their rusty sedan, Logan's wide, innocent eyes drank in the scene outside, his small chin propped on the window's edge, his breath fogging the glass in tiny bursts. To the 6-year-old, his father wasn't just tinkering with a stranger's broken-down truck. Ben, his work shirt streaked with grease, his face creased with concentration, was a hero straight out of a storybook, battling the chaos of a wrench and sheer determination. Ben's sheer will, Ben's hands moved with a quiet expertise, his thoughts drifting as he leaned over the engine. The stranger's truck was a stubborn beast, its guts a puzzle of worn parts and neglect. But Ben didn't mind the challenge. Fixing things, whether a car, a moment, or a life, was what kept him steady since Melissa's death had unraveled everything. He could feel Logan's gaze on him, that unspoken pride swelling in his son's chest, and it anchored him. For nearly an hour, Ben wrestled with the engine, his fingers raw and black with oil, until at last it roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble. It coughed, hesitated, then settled into a smooth, reassuring purr. Ben tapped the hood twice, a small ritual of triumph, and stepped back, wiping his hands on a tattered rag. "She'll get you home," he said, his voice steady but kind, carrying the weight of a man who knew what it felt like to be stranded in more ways than one. The older man in the truck, who'd been silent until now, fixed his sharp blue eyes on Ben. His weathered face held a quiet intensity, like he was weighing something heavier than words. "You didn't even ask my name," he said, his tone low and deliberate, almost as if testing Ben's character. Ben gave a slight shrug, unperturbed. "Didn't need to," he replied, his voice soft but sure. "But I won't forget yours." The words hung in the air, charged with a quiet understanding that neither man could quite name. It wasn't the end of a roadside favor, but felt more like the opening of something unknown, something that stirred a faint unease in Ben's gut. The man nodded once, his expression unreadable, then climbed into his truck. As he drove off, the tires kicked up dust that swirled in the fading sunlight, and Ben stood there, his eyes tracking the vehicle until it vanished down the cracked asphalt road. Logan's small hand tugged at his sleeve, his face glowing with that look of awe no amount of wealth could ever buy, pure, unfiltered admiration. "Dad," he asked, his voice brimming with curiosity, "do you think he was someone important?" Ben's faint smile held a trace of melancholy. "Doesn't matter, buddy. He needed help. That's all I saw." That moment lingered in Ben's mind as he drove home, Logan's question echoing against the hum of the Jeep's engine. It was a belief he'd carried from his military days, a code that had guided him through the chaos of war and into the quieter but no less brutal struggles of civilian life. You help people because it's right, not because of who they are. Back then in the desert, it was about survival, yours and the guy next to you. Now it was about showing Logan what it meant to be a man, not the kind who chased glory, but the kind who did the work that needed doing. That night, after Logan was tucked into bed, the house fell into its familiar hush. Ben sat at the kitchen table, the faint tick of the clock on the wall keeping him company. He replayed the encounter with the stranger, his mind snagging on details he hadn't noticed in the moment. The man's silence wasn't just reserved, it was deliberate, almost calculated. His presence had a weight to it, not threatening, but not entirely benign either. It felt incomplete, like a conversation cut off mid-sentence. Ben's fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug, now cold, as a flicker of unease settled in his chest. Something about that truck, that man, didn't sit right. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just brushed up against something bigger than a roadside breakdown. Morning broke with the same weary routine. The kitchen filled with the bitter scent of instant coffee as Ben sliced a bruised apple for Logan's breakfast, his knife moving with practiced care. The toaster sputtered, spitting out unevenly browned bread, and the ancient ceiling fan above clanked with every sluggish rotation, as if protesting its own existence. The house itself groaned, its creaks in size blending with the soft patter of Logan's chatter about dinosaurs and monster trucks, his milk-soaked toast leaving crumbs scattered across the table. Sunlight slipped through the faded curtains, casting slanted rays across a pile of overdue bills stacked haphazardly on the counter. Ben avoided looking at them, their presence a quiet accusation of the life he was barely holding together. Then came the sound, a low, ominous rumble, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel and the sharp blare of a horn. Ben's brow furrowed, a prickle of instinct stirring in his chest. He crossed to the front window, parting the curtain, and froze. Three black SUVs sat parked in a precise line along the curb, their polished surfaces gleaming under the morning sun like they'd been dropped into his rundown neighborhood from another world. Tinted windows, government plates, and an air of silent authority that didn't need flashing lights to make its point. Ben's body tensed, his old military instincts flaring before his mind could catch up. These weren't cops, but they were something close, something official, and something serious. "Daddy?" Logan's small voice piped up from behind, tinged with a mix of curiosity and unease. "There's people outside." Ben forced a calm he didn't feel, turning to ruffle his son's hair. "Stay here, bud," he said, his tone gentle but firm. He stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, a dish towel still draped over his shoulder, feeling absurdly exposed. His front yard was a mess, patchy grass, Logan's plastic toys strewn about like forgotten relics. It was a life he'd worked hard to keep private, unremarkable, and now it felt like someone had aimed a spotlight on it. From the middle SUV, a man stepped out. Tall, silver-haired, and dressed in plain clothes that somehow screamed authority, he moved with the measured confidence of someone used to being obeyed. His eyes locked onto Ben's, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Ben's heart thudded, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. Whoever this man was, whatever he wanted, it was tied to that truck, that stranger, that moment on the side of the road. And Ben knew with a sinking certainty that his quiet life was about to unravel. Ben Carter stood on his weathered porch, the morning air sharp against his skin, watching the black SUVs roll up his gravel driveway like shadows creeping across a battlefield. His posture stiffened instinctively, shoulders squaring, chest expanding, a reflex from his army days that never quite faded. The lead vehicle stopped, and a man stepped out, his bearing so precise it could have been carved from granite. Chin level, eyes locked forward, every movement deliberate. Two others followed, their gazes sweeping the surroundings with the quiet vigilance of trained operatives, taking in the sagging roof of Ben's modest home, the overgrown grass, the rusted swing set where Logan played. Ben's pulse quickened, his mind spiraling through a maze of possibilities, each darker than the last. Was this about his discharge? A mix-up with the VA? Or worse, had Melissa's parents stirred up some legal trouble over custody? He gripped the porch railing, the wood rough under his calloused hands, grounding him as the man approached. The stranger moved with a calm authority, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. When he reached the porch, he produced a leather folder, flipping it open with practiced ease to reveal a badge and credentials that gleamed with official weight. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice steady, carrying the cadence of someone used to being obeyed. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Whitaker, formerly with Joint Special Operations Command. We're here on behalf of the Veteran Personnel Outreach Division. Someone you met yesterday would like to speak with you." Ben's heart thudded harder, a drumbeat of unease. Yesterday? His mind raced back to the old man by the roadside, the broken-down truck, the hours spent under the hood, grease staining his hands as he coaxed the engine back to life. It had been a simple act, one he hadn't thought twice about. But now, as the SUV's rear door opened and a tall, composed figure emerged, Ben's breath caught. The old man from yesterday, but not as Ben remembered him. Gone was the stained jacket and weary slouch. Now he wore a pressed gray blazer, its fabric crisp against the morning light, and polished boots that reflected years of discipline. His eyes, still sharp with that same calm detachment, held a weight Ben hadn't noticed before. A commanding presence that made Ben straighten without thinking. Old instincts snapping into place. The man stepped forward, his voice clear and resonant. "Ben Carter," he said. "I'm General Nathaniel Caldwell, retired. I served as commander of operations in Afghanistan and now advise the Department of Defense. Yesterday, you fixed my truck without asking who I was or what I wanted. Ben's jaw tightened, a flicker of pride warring with his confusion. Sir, I didn't know, he started. But Caldwell raised a hand, nodding slightly. Exactly. And that's why I'm here. He glanced at the porch, his expression softening just enough to seem human. May we come inside? Ben hesitated, his mind a tangle of doubt and curiosity. This wasn't just about a truck. He nodded, stepping aside. Please, come in. As the group entered, Logan, Ben's 6-year-old son, peeked from the hallway, his wide eyes catching the glint of Whitaker's badge. Caldwell crouched slightly, his imposing frame softening as he met the boy's gaze with a warm smile. You must be Logan, he said, his voice gentler now, like a grandfather sharing a secret. Your dad's a good man. Logan blinked, clutching a toy truck, his voice small but proud. He fixes stuff, like everything. Ben's chest warmed, a fleeting smile breaking through his guarded expression. He ruffled Logan's hair. Go play for a bit, buddy. I'll be right there. Logan scampered off, casting one last curious glance at the strangers. In the kitchen, Ben sat across from Caldwell at the worn table, its surface scarred from years of cereal spills and late-night worries. The fridge hummed unevenly in the corner, a reminder of the life he'd been piecing together since leaving the army. Caldwell's presence felt out of place here, like a general in a foxhole. Ben's hands rested on the table, steady but ready, as if this were a debrief in Iraq or Germany, not his own home. Caldwell's tone shifted, serious now, cutting through the hum of the fridge. Mr. Carter, yesterday you did more than fix a truck. You proved something we've been searching for, a principle. You helped a stranger without knowing his name, his rank, or his purpose. That kind of character is rare, and it's exactly what this country needs. He slid a crisp envelope across the table, its edges sharp, official. I'd like to make you an offer. Ben's eyes locked on the envelope, his pulse a steady thrum in his ears. It looked like trouble or opportunity, maybe both. He didn't touch it. What kind of offer? He asked, his voice low, guarded. Caldwell's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that held more answers than it gave. One that could change everything for you and your son. Outside, the SUV sat silent, their dark shapes unmoving, but inside, Ben's world felt like it was tilting on its axis. The envelope lay there untouched, a silent challenge on the kitchen table. Ben's gaze flickered between it and Caldwell, who sat with the kind of calm that came from years of making decisions that altered lives. The general's presence filled the room, not just with authority but with quiet expectation, as if he already knew Ben's answer. Ben's mind churned, replaying the years since he'd left the army, the struggle to keep the house, the nights spent worrying about Logan's future, the weight of being a single father in a world that didn't pause for second chances. You're offering me Ben said finally, his voice steady but laced with skepticism. Because I fixed your truck, General. Caldwell didn't flinch, his eyes holding Ben's with unwavering focus. No, Mr. Carter. I'm offering you a future because you fixed it for the right reasons. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Ben's doubts. He leaned back, his chair creaking under the shift of his weight and his mind grappling with the implications. No college degree, no fancy resume, just a toolbox, a rundown house, and a son who thought his dad could fix anything. I haven't worked in an official capacity since the army, Ben said, his tone cautious, testing the waters. Most of what I do now is patch jobs, cars, roofs, whatever needs fixing. Caldwell's faint smile returned, but this time it carried a hint of respect. That's exactly why you're the man we need. Ben's thoughts drifted to Logan, playing in his room, oblivious to the gravity of this moment. Whatever was in that envelope, it wasn't just about him. It was about the life he wanted for his son. A life where the fridge didn't rattle, where the roof didn't leak, where Logan could dream bigger than a swing set in a weedy backyard. But trust didn't come easy to Ben, not after years of promises that turned to dust. He glanced at the envelope again, its crisp edges taunting him with possibilities. Trouble or opportunity? His fingers twitched, but he kept them still, his voice steady. What exactly are you asking me to do, General? Caldwell leaned forward, his eyes glinting with purpose. Open the envelope, Mr. Carter. Let's talk about what's next. Ben sat in the worn driver's seat of his pickup, the engine still ticking from a long way under the hoods of tractors or racing across county lines to hunt down elusive parts. His hands, calloused and stained with grease, gripped the steering wheel, though the truck wasn't moving. He was just a guy, he told himself, a mechanic from a small town. No one extraordinary. The weight of that thought settled into his chest, heavy as the toolbox rattling in the truck bed behind him. But then Caldwell, the sharp-eyed man in the pressed suit, tilted his head, one eyebrow arching like he'd heard something absurd. "That's where you're wrong, Ben," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the haze of Ben's self-doubt. "You're exactly the kind of person we need. That toolbox? That's your resume better than any piece of paper." Ben let out a low chuckle, half from disbelief, half because laughing was easier than letting hope creep in. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood echoing in the quiet of his modest living room. "So, what's this about? Some kind of recruitment pitch?" His voice carried the wariness of a man who'd heard too many promises that turned to dust. Caldwell's eyes didn't waver. "Something like that," he replied, his tone measured but warm. "We're launching a pilot program, the Veteran Technical Corps. It's built for people like you, veterans with real-world know-how, the kind of mechanical and operational grit that keeps things running. We're talking about rebuilding America's backbone. Power grids, water systems, emergency vehicles, communication lines. The stuff nobody notices until it breaks." Ben tilted his head, his brow furrowing as he tried to picture it. His life was a patchwork of long hours, late bills, and the constant grind of making ends meet. "You want me to fix pipes or something?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism, but also a flicker of curiosity he couldn't quite suppress. Caldwell leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, like he was sharing a secret meant just for Ben. "No, Ben, I want you to help fix a broken system, one where people like you, skilled, disciplined, loyal to a fault, get overlooked because you didn't chase a degree or climb some corporate ladder. That's the real problem, and we're done letting it fester." He gestured to a manila envelope on the table, its edges crisp and official. "That's your offer, a real one. Salary triple what you're scraping by on now. Housing assistance, health insurance, a guaranteed spot in Georgia, and a tuition voucher for Logan when he's ready for school." Ben's gaze fell to the envelope, but he didn't touch it. His hands rested on either side, fingers splayed as if it were a relic, too sacred to disturb. His mind drifted to Logan, his boy, whose sneakers were held together with duct tape, whose laughter still rang out despite the rust-stained bathtub that mocked Ben's every effort to provide. He thought of the night he'd sat in the dark bathroom, the weight of the world pressing down on him, tears burning his eyes because he couldn't afford to fix the leaking roof and buy groceries in the same month. The memory clawed at him, raw and unrelenting, a reminder of how close he'd come to breaking. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with the doubt that had rooted itself deep in his soul. "Why not someone with a degree, some fancy credentials?" Caldwell's answer was simple, direct, like a blade cutting through the fog. "Because credentials don't mean character." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Yesterday was my 14th staged roadside breakdown across 3 states. You were the first person who pulled over, no hesitation, no questions, no thought of getting paid. You didn't even know who I was." Ben froze, his breath catching as the weight of Caldwell's words settled over him. He remembered the stranded car, the man in the suit looking out of place on the dusty shoulder of the highway. Ben had stopped because that's what you do, because someone needed help, and he had the tools to offer it. "You saw someone in trouble," Caldwell continued, his voice steady but laced with admiration, "and you acted. That tells me more about you than a stack of resumes ever could." The room fell silent, the only sounds the faint hum of Logan playing in his bedroom and the soft rustle of a breeze stirring the faded curtains. Ben's heart thudded in his chest, a mix of disbelief and something he hadn't felt in years, hope. He reached for the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a neatly typed offer, every detail laid out with precision. The training schedule, the salary, the housing plan, the location in Georgia, the benefits, the contact numbers. It wasn't just words on a page, it was a lifeline, a structure, a future he could almost taste. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I thought people like me were invisible," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of years spent feeling unseen. Caldwell's expression softened, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "We see you, Ben, and now it's time to act on it." Ben nodded, the motion slow, deliberate, as if he were testing the ground beneath him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but he knew he couldn't keep living in survival mode, scraping by while Logan's dreams hung in the balance. His son deserved more than hand-me-downs and a father who felt like he was failing him. Maybe this wasn't a miracle, Ben thought. Maybe it was just someone finally noticing a man who'd kept doing the right thing, even when the world turned its back. Caldwell stood, buttoning his jacket with a practiced motion. "You've got 48 hours to decide. Training starts next month in Atlanta. You'll be home on weekends." Ben rose too, his legs steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. They shook hands, the grip firm, wordless, carrying the weight of a soldier's bond. "Oh," Caldwell added, pausing halfway to the door, a glint of humor in his eyes. "Bring your tools. First day's a hands-on assessment." Ben's lips curved into a small, genuine smile, the kind that felt foreign after so long. "That I can do," he said, his voice steadier now, anchored by the spark of purpose igniting within him. As Caldwell's black SUVs rolled away, kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the fading light, Ben leaned against the porch rail, the envelope still clutched in his hand. He looked out at the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of possibility, a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, he and Logan could build a life beyond the struggle. The weight of the envelope felt like a key, not to a miracle, but to a future earned through the grit and goodness he'd never stopped offering, even when no one was watching. Ben Carter stood at the edge of a new chapter, his boots planted firmly on a path he couldn't yet see to its end. For the first time in years, a spark of hope flickered in his chest, untainted by the fear that had shadowed him for so long. 6 months, just half a year, had reshaped his world in ways he'd never dared to dream. When Ben first stepped into the Veteran Technical Corps Training Center in Atlanta, a wave of doubt crashed over him. The classrooms buzzed with men and women whose faces bore the weight of service. Former soldiers, sailors, mechanics, and medics, their hands rough and calloused, their eyes carrying stories of sacrifice and survival. Each one, like Ben, had known years of struggle after leaving the uniform behind. The technology they were learning was sleek and unfamiliar, a far cry from the tools Ben had last handled. Sitting at a desk, pencil in hand, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. He hadn't taken notes since high school, and the flow of new systems, digital interfaces, diagnostic software, left him dizzy. In those early weeks, his mind churned with insecurity. What if I'm too far behind? What if I fail Logan? But beneath the doubt, a stubborn resolve simmered, forged in battles far darker than any classroom. That grit, that muscle memory of perseverance, refused to let him quit. Day by day, Ben clawed his way forward. He lingered after class, poring over manuals until the words stopped swimming. He raised his hand, voice steady despite the knot in his stomach, asking questions that others were too shy to voice. He noticed a struggling classmate, a former medic named Sarah, her brow furrowed over a wiring diagram, and offered to walk her through it. The gratitude in her eyes lit something in him, a quiet pride he hadn't felt in years. By the time the hands-on assessments rolled around, Ben wasn't just keeping up. He was leading. His hands moved with a sureness that surprised even him, diagnosing faults and rerouting systems like he'd been doing it all his life. His classmates looked to him, not just for answers, but for the calm confidence he radiated. When the program ended, the instructors didn't just hand him a certificate, they pulled him aside, their words heavy with respect. "You've got something special, Ben," his supervisor said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Experience, sure, but it's more than that. It's your humility, the way you lift others up. Your peers trust you. We'd like you to take on a leadership role." Ben's throat tightened, and for a moment, he could only nod, the weight of their belief in him sinking deep. Back home in rural Georgia, life was blooming in ways Ben hadn't thought possible. His son, Logan, now 6, was thriving in a new school, one with bright classrooms and teachers who saw his potential. Their new rental house was a haven, solid walls, a roof that didn't leak, and a furnace that hummed reliably through the chilly nights. In the backyard, Ben spent a weekend hauling lumber and sand, building a sandbox for Logan with his own hands. The boy's laughter as he dug in the sand was a sound Ben tucked away in his heart, a reminder of why he kept pushing. He still tinkered, fixing a dripping faucet in their kitchen, coaxing an old neighbor's lawnmower back to life, or rebuilding an engine just for the joy of it. But now those fixes weren't born of desperation. They were choices made on his own terms, and that freedom tasted sweeter than he could have imagined. The job that came after the training program was more than a paycheck, it was a purpose. Ben was put in charge of infrastructure assessments across rural Georgia, leading teams to inspect power lines, coordinate with water treatment plants, and ensure small towns had the systems they needed to thrive. He trained new recruits in the veteran technical corps, men and women like him, each carrying their own scars and hopes. Every morning as he laced up his worn work boots, Ben thought back to the day someone had looked past his threadbare clothes and battered toolbox. That moment when a stranger saw not just a mechanic but a man with potential had changed everything. It fueled him now, a quiet fire that drove him to see the same in others. A year later, an unexpected letter arrived, its official seal catching Ben off guard. General Caldwell, now a senior advisor to the president, had invited him to Washington, D.C., to speak at a congressional briefing on veteran workforce development. Ben stared at the invitation, his heart pounding. He'd never spoken into a microphone, never stood before a room of suits and policymakers. Yet as he boarded the train to D.C., dressed in a gray suit that still felt stiff and unfamiliar, a calm settled over him. He wasn't nervous, not really. He was ready to tell his truth. Standing before the committee, Ben's voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of his journey. "I didn't come looking for charity," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "I wanted a chance to keep serving this country, to prove I still had something to give. Someone saw that in me, not my resume, not my past mistakes, but my character. That's all I needed." Cameras flashed, pencils scratched across notepads, but Ben barely noticed. His mind was on the countless veterans he'd met, the ones who'd faded into the background after their service, their skills and spirit overlooked. He spoke for them, for every soldier who'd ever felt invisible. The impact of that day rippled far beyond the briefing room. The Veteran Technical Corps grew, its model spreading to new states, partnering with technical colleges and local governments. Ben found himself at the heart of it, not just a mechanic anymore, but a mentor, a beacon of what was possible when a nation remembered its veterans. His days were packed with site visits, project plans, and training sessions, each one a chance to pay forward the belief someone had shown in him. Yet no matter how full his schedule, Ben always carved out time for Logan. They ate dinner together every night, trading stories over plates of spaghetti or grilled chicken. At bedtime, Ben read to him, adventure tales or silly rhymes, savoring the way Logan's eyes grew heavy with trust. On weekends, they'd tinker in the garage, rebuilding an old carburetor or piecing together a go-kart, their hands smudged with grease, their laughter filling the air. Sometimes they'd stop by Mr. Dobbs' house down the road, fixing a creaky heater or swapping out a light fixture. Those visits weren't just favors. They were for Ben a way to stay rooted, to hold tight to the simple joys that kept him whole. Ben Carter's life had changed, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, transformative power of opportunity. He walked a road now, not knowing its end, but certain of its direction. And with every step, he carried Logan, the veterans he mentored, and the memory of a day when someone had seen in him a spark worth kindling. In a small, sunlit corner of Ben Carter's modest office, an old, weathered envelope sat quietly on a shelf, its edges frayed from time but untouched by neglect. It was a keepsake from General Nathaniel Caldwell, handed to Ben years ago with a weight that transcended its simplicity. Ben could still recall the moment he received it, the way it felt in his calloused hands, a tangible reminder that life's greatest opportunities often arrive without fanfare. They don't always come wrapped in pomp or circumstance. Sometimes they roll up in the form of three sleek black SUVs, a stranger's quiet nod, and a truck that refused to start on a dusty Georgia roadside. That envelope was more than paper. It was a symbol of the moment Ben's life shifted from survival to purpose, from being overlooked to becoming a cornerstone of something greater. Yet, through it all, Ben's heart remained anchored to a simple truth. People were worth helping, no matter who they were. For him, fixing a broken thing, whether a truck or a life, wasn't just a task. It was a way of healing the world, one small act at a time. Years earlier, on a warm afternoon, Ben's young son, Logan, had squinted up at him with a child's unfiltered curiosity. "Dad, why'd you help that guy? He wasn't nice to you." Ben had paused, wiping grease from his hands, his weathered face softening into a smile that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "It's not about who they are, Logan," he'd said, his voice steady but warm, like a fire that comforts rather than burns. "It's about who we are." Those words weren't just for Logan. They were Ben's North Star, a creed he carried from his days in uniform to the quiet struggles of civilian life. He'd seen enough of the world to know that kindness wasn't a transaction. It was a choice, one that defined a person's soul more than any paycheck or title ever could. Logan, barely 4, had nodded solemnly, his small hand clutching the toy car he'd been playing with while Ben worked on that stranger's truck. In that moment, Ben wasn't just fixing an engine. He was passing down a legacy, one his son would carry into the future. That single act of roadside kindness had been the spark for something far bigger than Ben could have imagined. General Nathaniel Caldwell, a man whose presence commanded respect without demanding it, stood before Congress one crisp morning, his voice steady as he recounted the story of a veteran who knelt in the dirt to help a stranger. Caldwell's eyes, sharp but kind, scanned the room as he spoke, not of grand heroics, but of something quieter, more enduring, invisible service. "This man," Caldwell said, his words deliberate, "didn't ask for a name or a thank you. He saw a need and met it, with his son waiting patiently in the car." The room, filled with polished suits and skeptical glances, seemed to hold its breath. Caldwell didn't lean on sentimentality or pity. He spoke of purpose, of a nation's strength lying not in its budgets or machines, but in the character of its people. "We invest billions in technology, in readiness, in systems," he told them, his voice rising with a conviction. "But the true backbone of this country is in men like Ben Carter, people who, even after hanging up their uniforms, live by the code they swore to uphold." Ben, back in Georgia, hadn't known his story was being shared on such a stage. He was too busy working, his hands still stained with grease, his old truck still rattling along the same backroads. But Caldwell's words struck a chord. The hearing room's energy shifted as lawmakers leaned forward, some nodding, others scribbling notes. The story of Ben Carter, a man who'd once felt invisible, scraping by in a world that seemed to have forgotten him, began to ripple outward. News outlets caught wind of it, their headlines painting Ben as a symbol of quiet resilience. Veteran organizations shared his story, amplifying it until it reached small towns in Nebraska, flood-ravaged neighborhoods in Louisiana, and struggling power grids in Appalachia. Everywhere there were broken systems, failing infrastructure, overlooked communities. There were veterans like Ben, their skills untapped, their spirits ready to serve again. His story wasn't just about one man anymore. It was a call to action, a reminder that the nation's strength lay in its people, not its policies. The impact was undeniable. Applications to the Veteran Technical Corps surged as men and women who'd once worn uniforms saw a chance to reclaim their purpose. Colleges and trade schools formed partnerships, eager to train and empower this underutilized workforce. Cities launched local chapters, creating networks of skilled hands ready to rebuild what was broken. Ben, though, stayed grounded. He turned down invitations to national morning shows, his voice calm but firm when producers pressed him. "I'm not here for the spotlight," he'd say, his Georgia drawl softening the rejection. He declined a book deal with the same quiet resolve, explaining, "I didn't fix that truck to be remembered. I fixed it because someone once fixed mine. Those words carried the weight of a life lived in service, a life shaped by moments of kindness that others might have overlooked. Ben remembered the stranger who'd once helped him when his own truck broke down, a small act that had kept him going in his darkest days. Now he was paying it forward, not for recognition, but because it was right. Behind the scenes, Ben became a quiet force of change. He joined advisory boards, his practical wisdom shaping programs that valued hands-on skills over polished resumes. He traveled to rural towns and urban centers alike, speaking with veterans who'd lost hope, their eyes dimmed by years of being overlooked. Ben listened more than he spoke, his presence steady and reassuring. He understood their struggles, the weight of returning to a world that didn't always know how to welcome them back. One evening after a town hall in a small Kansas community, a woman in her 60s approached him, her hands trembling as she clasped his. Her son, a veteran who'd come home lost, had found purpose building solar arrays through the Corps. He smiles again. "Mr. Carter," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "You gave me my boy back." Ben felt a lump in his throat, not because he saw himself as a hero, but because he knew what it meant to feel invisible. He didn't need praise, he needed to know he'd made a difference. Ben's life hadn't changed on the surface. He still drove the same battered truck, still wore the same worn boots, still sat on his porch with Logan some evenings, the two of them sharing a quiet that felt whole. But he understood now that small acts could send ripples across a nation. One truck, one choice, one life lifted, and then another, and another. General Caldwell never forgot that moment on the roadside, when Ben knelt in the dirt without hesitation. He used it as a touchstone, a story he told lawmakers and communities to remind them what service truly meant. "We don't just need to thank veterans," Caldwell said, his voice firm but earnest. "We need to empower them. Let them build, fix, lead, not out of charity, but because they're the best at it." Those words carried Ben's values to the halls of power, shaping policies that gave veterans like him a chance to shine. Ben Carter had once felt like a shadow, a man the world had passed by. Now, his quiet act of kindness had sparked a movement, a reminder that character could change more than speeches or headlines ever could. His story wasn't about fame or medals, it was about values, ones passed down from father to son, from soldier to civilian, from one generation to the next. In a country where so many felt unseen, veterans, workers, parents struggling to get by, Ben's life was a testament to the power of showing up. He fixed what was broken, not for reward, but because it was right. And in doing so, he reminded a nation that its strength lay not in who was in charge, but in who was still willing to lend a hand.